I believe that the greatest organizations I've ever had the privilege of being part of building and or changing and or just being part of before I ever became a senior officer in an organization were all about values. And the values to me collectively make up the culture. It's very interesting. We really believe that values, whether you define them or not, are part of an organization. Culture happens, you know, Joel brought it up. You will always have a culture. I don't think probably Sam Walton sat in a room and said, this is what we want the organization to look like. But if you know the story of Sam Walton and how he built Walmart, what were some of the things that you would think would be part of the culture of a Walmart when Sam was starting it? Do you know how Sam went to work every day? Does anybody, have you read the story about Sam Walton? He drove an old pickup truck. He came in jeans and old clothes, right? He always tried to hitchhike with his guys that were driving the truck so he could get information that was not distilled. What he was about was reality. I think he was one of the most authentic people probably in his leadership model. He was a good friend of Herb Kelleher's, actually. In fact, Herb was a pallbearer at his funeral. And one of the things they both really felt was important was being an authentic leader. And it probably just happened because that's who he was, because leaders drive the culture. And then one of the board members is on a board with me at P.F. Chang's, and he said, Ann, I have to give you an example of that. When we decided to go to Japan, that the cost of entry was so expensive that we weren't sure we wanted to do it because everyone there that was our development partner told us that we had to open in a smoking environment. And as you know, Starbucks has been non-smoking since their inception. It's one of their values. And what's interesting is they went around the room and they talked about how many hundreds of millions it cost to open Japan. And what would it mean in terms, should they fail, what would that mean? And should they, in fact, make the decision perhaps to maybe open it and make it a smoking environment, which would be their first. Wholesalely, every single person said, we cannot give up on our values. We need to open it the way we've opened everything else. We need to open it in a non-smoking environment. And what happened was, of course, Japan was very, very successful for them because what they found out was that many people were just looking for that, even though many people smoked there. Many people that did not were looking for an environment where they did not smoke. It just is another example of one of the things we tell people is whatever the values are of the organization, make sure that you use them when you're making the small decisions and the large decisions. Really remember that whatever you do as a leader, people will see your values whether you have defined them or not. They will also see how you behave because the behaviors are what define your values. I think people forget behaviors are so critical. The reason I ask people to describe those great environments and those great cultures they've been around is that typically they define the behaviors. When you talk about Nordstrom's, most people will define how they received some outstanding level of service from Nordstrom's. I talk about stories all the time because I think they're wonderful on great customer service. But it's about behaviors, and I think people forget. They put values on the wall, so they put integrity on the wall, but no one coming into the organization knows what that means in terms of their behaviors. Actually, we had an IT guy that came to see me once after I had given a speech, and he said, you know what? I can't stand working for this place. I said, really? What is it you don't like about Southwest? He said, people have fun here every day. They smile, they like each other. You have to talk to each other in the bathrooms. I said, really? And he said, you know, I just don't like it here. This is just too nice for me, too friendly. I said, you know, I know a place that would just love having you. It's still in Dallas. It's another airline, and I think you sound just like a good employee for them. We wrote his resume, literally, and we took him over to American, and he started working for American. But you know what? His values and his behaviors didn't fit Southwest. When you know that your culture works, the people that don't believe they fit it will absolutely self-eject. That's when you know you've done a good job, when you get people to self-eject. To me, that is critical, and it's a big indicator of a high-performing organization. We just started working for a company that is a startup. It's 3 years old. It's an online real estate company, and it's called Redfin. The individual who started is Glenn Krevlin. I don't know if anyone knows him, but this is his third startup. He's probably 40, 41 years old, and he's just a brilliant guy, young entrepreneur, Stanford guy. And I will tell you that one of the things he has found over the years is that when he starts organizations, defining the values is critically important. Sits in a room, and in fact, when we did it for him with Redfin, we sat in a room with, 40 or 50 of all of his people. It was maybe 50 people. They now have tripled that number. But he said, let's define who we want to be when we grow up. That's why you define your values. It's great to describe what you want to be when you grow up. When it was JetBlue, there were only 10 of us, and we sat in a room and said, these are going to be the 5 values. And we said, this is what we want to stand for. And even more importantly, what he did, and what I love as an example is, I love these values: fire, wow, rally, genuine, and honorable. And he is now holding everyone accountable to these values. He is holding himself and having the board hold him accountable, his VCs, to these values. And everyone who comes into that organization knows what the expectation is. I don't think people should have to come into the organization and find out the expectation is something that they can't live with after they've been hired. What I love about defining your values up front and the behaviors is that then everyone knows the expectation. And what do we want when we go to work somewhere? We want to know what's expected of us. What we did at JetBlue, when there were 10 of us and we described these sitting in a room, and we had flight attendants, we had our first technician there, Shelley and I were there, a number of people that were from various areas. It was only 10 employees we had in the company, maybe it was 10 or 12. And we said, this is what we want to be when we grow up. And I can tell you, if you have 2 people, if you have 50, if you have 100, if you haven't defined the values and the behaviors, it will not be as clear to people. And what you want is to clearly define who you are. One of the things I would tell you is, since your culture is going to occur anyway, why don't you define it your way? Why don't you be in charge of your own destiny by talking about who you want to be? Thank you all.